Welcome everyone to our next presentation, TUG 2021. We have Marcel Krüger, who works on font support code for LuaLaTeX, who is going to be talking about reviving Type 3 fonts for modern LuaLaTeX documents.
Marcel, you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
That's great. Okay, this microphone seems to work better. Okay, can you also already see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I should confirm if I actually want this. Yes. Oh, sliding. Okay.
We can see it now.
Now you should see it. Great. Okay, welcome to my talk about reviving Type 3 fonts for more LuaLaTeX documents. Thank you for listening. And I plan to have more or less 3 parts in this talk. First, I talk a bit about different font technologies and what Type 3 fonts are, and also on why we normally don't want to use them in most documents. And then I will talk a bit about color fonts and why we started to introduce color fonts. And then I will try to combine this and show you that Type 3 fonts actually are a good solution in this context. So let's start. When talking about Type 3 or Type 1 or any of these font formats with names, they always refer to PostScript font numbers. And there are quite a bunch of them. Yeah, the title is missing. Anyway, I hope this still works. Okay, this is just a complete list of all the font formats which are defined in current PostScript levels. And most of them are not particularly important for us. I will just highlight the ones which are actually still present for PDF files. So basically we have Type 0 fonts, but they are weird and we don't really have to think about them because they just consist of other fonts. And the most important type is Type 1. These are the classical PostScript fonts we normally talk about, and they support hinting and they are outline fonts. So they only define the outline of the glyphs and are not bitmap based or similar. The Type 2 is not highlighted, even though that's a bit misleading. CFF fonts are basically a compressed version of Type 1 fonts, and we still use them. We just don't call them Type 2 anymore, but compressed Type 1 or similar. And of course, the type we really want to talk about today is Type 3, which traditionally always allowed arbitrary PostScript code to be executed for each individual character. So it allowed you to basically draw arbitrary stuff in your font. And this was particularly important when it was first introduced because Type 1 fonts were proprietary and encrypted and you couldn't create them on your own. So everyone who did not have the blessing of Adobe had to create Type 3 fonts, even if they just wanted to create outline fonts or if they wanted to create bitmap fonts, or basically anything else. It's one of the oldest font types in PostScript. Then these types, Type 9, Type 10, Type 11, and Type 32 are just subfonts which are used together with Type 0 fonts and they are not so important for us. type 14 is just weird and undocumented, and yeah, I think it has been removed even before I was born, so I will not tell you anything about this. And type 42 is another important one because that's just two type fonts, which it was created as an alternative to type 1 fonts, which was openly accessible. But we will not talk about TUG today. So in PDF, we basically only have these 4 types. We still have these composite fonts. We have type 1 fonts, type 3 fonts, and TUG type fonts. And type 3 font changed to some degree because they no longer allow arbitrary PostScript code, because that would have that would have required to embed a full PostScript interpreter in your PDF reader, which would have gone pretty much against the idea of PDF of no longer requiring such a big system. So now they just contain arbitrary PDF drawing instructions. So any graphic you can draw in your PDF file can also be used as a single glyph in a font. Okay, so that's the idea of these. And let's look at why we don't actually want them, even though they are very, very flexible and allow us to do many stuff. I will try to restart the presentation so that we actually get my slide titles, because otherwise it looks a bit weird. So yeah, I don't know what this will do with screen sharing. Okay. Yeah. Okay, now I just have to find Zoom again. Do you see my screen again?
Yes, I can see it, Marcel.
Okay, great. So what are the issues with type 3 fonts we usually have? The biggest one maybe is that they're much less portable than other fonts. And I don't mean this in the classical way of they only work on some systems, but basically we can't port them to other file formats. As I said, they can contain arbitrary PDF drawing instructions. So if you try to use them outside of a PDF file, then actually reading them would still require a full PDF viewer just to read a single font, which means that this isn't implemented anywhere. And so we can only really use them in PDF files, and that's much too limiting for regular fonts these days. Additionally, we don't have any kind of hinting support, which of course is an issue, especially for low resolution screens traditionally. But today it's much less important because we actually disable hinting on many systems anyway, because our modern screens often don't require it. But for example, on the screen I currently have in front of me, it really looks much better if we have hinting support because it has rather large pixels. And that's not available at all for type 3 fonts, especially because they are so very flexible. And hinting, especially PostScript type hinting, basically relies on telling the renderer how your fonts, which function the different parts of your drawing have in a glyph. And if you are very, very flexible in drawing stuff, then it's no longer feasible to actually explain to the renderer what's going on. Additionally, they have often very bad support in PDF viewers, especially because drawing stuff is normally used for drawing images and diagrams and similar things. So they work a bit differently than usual fonts, especially for very small features of fonts. which parts are important, which parts can be omitted, if white spaces can be omitted or if they are important, is very different for general drawing than for glyph drawing. And most PDF viewers don't actually pick up on the fact that type 3 fonts are actually fonts. So they just give you general drawing instructions. I think last year I had a slide in a presentation in the conference where I actually showed how this can go horribly wrong. And then there is another issue, especially in PDF files that actually wasn't present in PostScript, that the full support for using fonts which have more than 256 characters has never been adopted for type 3. So while we normally, especially in LuaLaTeX, have much, much bigger fonts than just 8-bit, we can't really do this in a single type 3 font, and we have to combine multiple type 3 fonts if we want to cover more than 256 characters. But maybe one of the biggest issues even vector-based type 3 fonts have is that we normally think of them as some kind of bitmap fonts, because especially LaTeX often generated type 3 fonts for metafont-based fonts, which were mapped to bitmap fonts, which are then embedded as type 3 fonts. So normally when a PDF viewer says that a font is a type 3 font, most people think about it as a bitmap font and want to get rid of it. Of course, if you want to talk about modern fonts, the first reaction we really don't want to have is, oh, this is an old bitmap font, let's get rid of it. So that's kind of an issue, which is mostly just caused by publicity, because type 3 fonts could create embed arbitrary vector instructions. It's just that they often don't. So, especially since we are anyway currently with bitmap fonts, that's, oh, right. So why would anyone use them? And for this, I will first tell you something about color fonts. Basically, color fonts were necessary because of emojis. Emojis have been added to the Unicode standard since in 2010. And here we see a classical emoji which didn't need and doesn't need any kind of color support because it's just a text character. But this introduced the whole idea that an emoji is actually just a text character, especially in an international context in, I think, Japan. It was a thing even before that. But since then, we basically treat emojis as just arbitrary text characters. And that became an issue when we actually started to think of emojis as something that should be colored, because they look much better if we actually can give them color. And especially since many of them are faces, having them black and white always seemed a bit odd. So we tried to add to OpenType fonts support for actually coloring our glyphs. Here we see an example from Noto color emoji of the same emoji as in the line above, but this time with colors. And of course, adding colors is complicated for our classical font formats because they were never really designed for this. OpenType files can contain either CFF, so basically type 1 fonts, or 2 type fonts. And both of these formats just describe an outline which is then filled in the current text color. But we don't want to have this for a color font because we actually want to influence which colors we have. And we often want to have different colors in different parts. And sometimes we even want to blend different colors together and have shadings and similar stuff. So we needed to extend the OpenType format. And since OpenType is really an extensible format and the standardization tends to just accept anything that's suggested, we got a whole bunch of formats for this. Especially CBDT tables is basically the Google format used for Android and also for Noto color traditionally. And basically it's just a bunch of PNG images embedded into an OpenType font. Then we have SBIX, which is basically the same, but from Apple. We have color, which I call color V0 here for reasons I will explain later. which is a Microsoft format which uses a different approach. It combines existing characters together. And so basically you can then color every one of them and they are printed on top of each other. So for example, if you would take the one I just showed here, if you wanted to have this emoji, we could first draw this shadow here as one glyph, which we then color in a dark color. Then we could draw this background here as a second glyph, and then this lighter area as a third glyph, and just leave the actual characters as in the background color. And that has some advantages, especially because we can reuse existing hinting infrastructure. But that's less important right now. And the fourth approach uses SVG fonts. And the whole thing gets even more complicated in newer versions because currently there is an evaluation of color v1 fonts, which is basically like color v0, but you can't just put the glyphs on top of each other, but you can basically also move them around and rotate them and even use color shadings to have more interesting glyphs. And it's more or less like re-implementing SVG, but as an OpenType table. And this is still in testing, but it will probably be released relatively soon. And for all of these, especially in doing LuaLaTeX development, the question comes up, how do we add them to our traditional PDF files? We can't just copy the font as is into the file because while PDF actually supports OpenType fonts, it doesn't support OpenType fonts with these kind of color support. So we basically have to map them to one of the types I mentioned at the beginning. Or we could treat them not as type fonts at all. So that's basically the easiest approach, which we can use for all engines out there. We can just include them as images. So first, we use external tools to translate an OpenType file into a bunch of image files, every one of which just contains one emoji. And then we just include them with include graphics or hidden behind some macros, which actually just call include graphics. And the big advantage is it works everywhere. There are packages for this kind of stuff which work in PDF. LaTeX, I don't know if they actually work with a DVI-based workflow, but I can't see any reason why they shouldn't. Sorry, that was the wrong key. That they have some big disadvantages. And one of the biggest ones is that they really don't behave like other glyphs. For example, if we have them in a mathematical font, we can't really use them as an extensible glyph because we actually need to get glyph to have it there. And there are also many other places where they act much more like macros because they actually are implemented as macros than as actual glyphs, both in TUG and in the PDF file later on. So if another program tries to analyze the PDF file, that also can lead to issues because it doesn't look like you try to add a character. That's especially an issue for some color fonts which are coming up, which don't just use these colors for emojis, but actually for arbitrary characters. The other disadvantage is that they are quite slow because we have to execute quite some TUG macros to include images every single time one of these characters is used, and copy and paste support is very, very limited because they behave like images, and copying an image does not do the same as copying a character. And of course, accessibility-wise, we basically have to be very, very explicit in order for them to behave correctly. Now, one step up from there, which is traditionally implemented in LuaOTF node today, and which is used if you currently try to use color fonts in LuaLaTeX, is to use virtual fonts instead. They work in basically all LuaTeX versions. They could also work in other TUG engines, but then you would have to create manual external font files for this, and in LuaTeX we can just dynamically generate them, so they work much better there. And they behave much more like a glyph in TUG. Basically, TUG's entire front end just treats them as a glyph, which also makes the thing much faster because as far as TUG is involved, we basically have no overhead from them. It's only if once we reach the back end that we actually still have to do the same work as previously. And accessibility is complicated for them, especially because we can, since there is a very centralized place where we can add instructions, we can basically add hints to the PDF file that they should be copied in a certain way and that they should be treated as a special character. But especially if they are in the end just images, that's not very supported. So it's kind of complicated and it very much depends on the reader tools. So disadvantages is they look quite different from PDF in the PDF file from other glyphs, and especially if you have external tools which try to analyze the PDF file, either for accessibility or just for reuse or similar, we really require them to support much more features if we want them to interpret such things correctly. And also they increase the PDF file size significantly. So basically the instructions for such a glyph can be quite big, especially for these color and color V1 glyphs I talked about, because they can contain relatively complicated instructions which then have to be repeated for every single glyph. And as I said, copy and paste support can be complicated. So the question is, we already, basically these color fonts all just contain arbitrary drawing instructions, and we already had this with type 3 fonts. So basically, you could say that color fonts are just reinventing type 3 fonts, and therefore it seems like an obvious idea to just use type 3 fonts to implement color fonts in the PDF file. This has quite some advantages, especially because it behaves exactly in the right way, because it is just a character as far as the PDF file is concerned. This also makes it much faster because we don't have to repeat any normal instructions in the PDF file. But accessibility is as good as for any other font you could use. Of course, we have to make sure to actually assign the right Unicode code points for every glyph, but that's important for other fonts too. We don't really have a lot of overhead in our text processing because we only in the end of the one time have to include the right fonts and don't have to do anything while actually executing the remaining document. And of course, we have good copy and paste support, basically for the same reasons as accessibility. But of course, we already mentioned that there are quite some disadvantages of type 3 fonts. So let's see how many of them still apply to this usage. One thing I added here, because it's only really relevant for LuaTeX, we need quite recent LuaTeX versions to actually use these correctly. In this case, recent LuaTeX version actually means the version included in TUG Live 2021. So in current LuaTeX versions, this is already available, so it's not a big problem. And I mentioned that it's not really portable to other file formats, but that's not really an issue because we just want to use them internally as a representation of much more portable files that we already have. Also, hinting support is kind of complicated, but it's not really an issue. For color fonts, the internal glyphs we use internally are already hinted, and that's still used even if they're hidden in a type 3 font. And for other formats, these color-based formats, we don't have hinting support, but we can't have hinting support for bitmap fonts anyway, so that's not specific to type 3 fonts at all. The bad viewer support also isn't much of an issue because in this case, we already know that basically for the same reason, all the other approaches we have exactly the same issue that they are just drawn as images in the PDF format. And that's not a big issue because we either have a small bitmap, which is basically treat it in the same way anyway, or we have again in color fonts that we already reuse internal glyphs which are done correctly. And for SVG fonts, the thing is we basically have this issue, but it's unavoidable anyway, so it's not type 3 specific. The whole 256 character thing is an issue we can't really avoid, but we can work around it by just using virtual fonts internally in a minimal way, just to emulate a bigger font, and then that's not really visible and just an implementation detail, which looks a bit odd if you list the fonts in a PDF file, but otherwise there's no problem with this. And of course, we still have the issue that these things are associated with bitmap fonts. And that actually can be quite a big issue, especially when we come to automated testing systems. I know quite some programs where uploading PDF files can actually just fail if the system thinks that you try to include bitmap fonts. And often the test, if something includes a bitmap font, is just, does it include some type 3 font? And if yes, especially if it's a LaTeX generated file, just assume that it's a bitmap font. But that's not a technical issue we can really address. It's basically, I think the only real way to get over that issue is to start experimenting with how we can use these fonts, and then actually start to use these fonts in small systems and in an opt-out way, so that people who actually encounter issues with this can disable them and go back to virtual fonts or similar, and then slowly change the mindset of the people to no longer think of bitmap fonts whenever they hear type 3. Okay, that was my talk. Thank you for listening. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Marcel. Really, any questions?
One question from my side. If you have, for instance, a logo as a PDF, is there a tool that can make from that small PDF logo font? Is there a tool to convert PDFs into font characters?
I'm not aware of such a tool, but I have some experimental LuaTeX code, which at least where you can basically take an arbitrary text command and convert them into a virtual font, as least usable within the LuaTeX document. So this could be used in that case, but that hasn't been released anywhere yet, and it just has been used for testing at this point. But basically an approach like this could be useful. That's also useful in other ways, because, for example, in mathematics, where we often have the case that operators are built by combining other ones, that where we can use basically the same approach of just entering arbitrary text code and say convert this to a glyph. But I don't know of any external tool for this.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, in that case, thank you very much, Marcel.